Welcome back, everyone, to episode 5 of our reaction series to VLAD the Impaler on Extra History. It's been fantastic. I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I have been in doing these reactions. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who over the last couple of days has responded and posted their stories on my video about my experience and what I remember about September 11th. I think last count we were somewhere at around 1,000 comments on that video in the first 2 days. So it just shows me how passionate people are, not only about sharing their stories, but about being a part of this community. So thank you for that. Please keep those coming. And if you guys like that sort of thing, I will try to do more of it when I have opportunities to remember other things that I've experienced firsthand in history, but that was certainly a big one. So we're going to dive into part 5. I'm still trying to decide whether or not I'm going to do the lies episode on this, but that may be something that we take a look at. If not, certainly check it out on your own. But I'll put the link in the description to episode 5, the original content. Let's dive in.
(1476), Constantinople. A messenger stands before Mehmed the Conqueror. He brings news of a victory against the tyrant Vlad III, who has massacred the faithful and spurned Mehmed's friendship. But the messenger didn't come alone. He carries a box, which upon its opening reveals the head of the treacherous, slain son of the dragon.
Yep.
Or, at least that's what one story says. Because like many of the stories in this series, the accounts of how Vlad died are contradictory. We just know that 2 months into his third reign, he fought a battle with the Ottomans and lost. In fact, it's kind of ironic that given all of the excruciating detail we have about how Vlad killed his foes, we know little about his own death. But death was not the end of Vlad Dracula. Because if there's one truth about human culture, it's this. When history doesn't provide a fitting end to a historical life,
we'll make one
legend's gonna step in to finish the job. And Dracula refused to stay in the grave.
So there's also a lot of, and I'm going to wait because I haven't seen this video yet, so I don't know what he's going to cover here. I don't want to say a bunch of stuff that then he says later, so I may wait till the end, but I want to take a look at a couple of the more modern stories associated with Vlad that have to do with speculation about where his final resting place is. And some of that's as recent as the last couple of years, but we'll take a look at that at the end.
Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping raise the stakes in historical storytelling. Despite his relatively brief time on the throne of Wallachia, less than 7 years in total, at the time of Vlad Dracula's death, he was already casting an outsized shadow over history. For instance, do you remember back in episode 3 when we talked about the parade of cruelty and massacre during Vlad's second reign? Well, one of those incidents that might have gotten lost in the sheer cacophony of awfulness was Vlad's massacre of Transylvanian Saxons in Brasov, an act that had huge consequences. See, those Saxons were German. And while they had come to the area a couple of centuries before, they still had family and trade ties with their homeland, which in the mid to late 15th century was one of Europe's greatest centers of printing and publishing. Now, many early books and pamphlets printed in Europe essentially functioned as political and religious propaganda. And
yeah, this is a time in history. There's a reason why there's so many consequential events that happen in the 1400s, the 1500s especially, because this is the birth of mass media at this time, the invention of the printing press. In fact, let's take a look at that real quick. So it all really kind of begins, I shouldn't say begins, because obviously anytime there's an invention, keep in mind that the person credited with the invention was not the first person to work on that thing. When we remember people like the Wright brothers, it's debated whether or not they were even the first people to fly, but they certainly were not the first people to make significant work on that. Thomas Edison was not the first person to create a light bulb. He perfected a process that had been worked on by many people. The photography, all of these inventions were worked on by many people over many decades and even centuries. But Johannes Gutenberg is generally credited with the printing press around 1440 in Germany, and that begins what they call the printing revolution. So take a look at this. 15th century. Yeah, remember, at this point in history, before the printing press, to get a copy of a book, it had to be handwritten. I mean, that was the way that you did things. Any copy of anything had to be handwritten. So the Bible, person had to sit there and actually write out the whole Bible. And they would do these elaborate illustrations. And it was beautiful work. And books were priceless because of it. And so now you see in Europe the output of printed books from 1450 up into 1800, but you see especially the 16th century where it just dramatically grows, and that changes the world in incredible ways. There was one other map I wanted to show you here, but I mean basically just look at this. In 1450, Gutenberg introduced movable type, which means you can take letters and you can put them in place, and then you could print a bunch of pages of the same thing using that movable type. And you can see how many impressions per hour could be made with these different things. But, it completely revolutionized the world doing that.
And after his massacres of Saxons in Brajov, Saxon printers made Vlad a favorite villain in their printings. Meaning, as Vlad cooled his heels as a captive in Hungary, he was becoming internationally famous for cruelty and butchery. A portrayal that only escalated after his death. Now, it's important to note that many of these stories printed about Vlad were exaggerated, and a bunch likely not true at all.
It's important to note that many stories printed about anybody in history are going to be exaggerated and biased and have an agenda. And, some people will try very, very hard to produce a work that sees things objectively, but that was not happening in the 15th, 16th, 17th century.
In fact, we've been very careful to not draw on them too much as sources, and label said sources appropriately in the rare times that we do. Because while this genre of writing was originally intended to smear one's enemies, it also became a sort of early horror literature. Even as far back as the 15th and 16th centuries, the general rule for publications was, if it bleeds, it leads. Meaning, stories of blood and guts sold well, particularly if they came along with gruesome woodblock prints. Even ostensibly serious religious books, like the 1563 publication Fox's Book of Martyrs, for instance, would...
Fox's Book of Martyrs is actually still being written today, and it was written as one of the very first, I don't want to say propaganda, because it was telling true stories, but it obviously there was a motive behind it, and the motive was to make the Catholic Church out to be these horrible people who were martyring all these Protestants who stood for what they believed. So people who, were executed for translating the Bible into English, for example, or for standing up against things that they didn't believe in, or things like transubstantiation and arguing that the body and blood of Christ was not physically present in communion. These are the kinds of things that got people thrown in jail, beaten, and often executed. And so Fox writes this book to tell these stories. And it's been reprinted even up to the modern times.
Would get spiced up with lurid scenes of Protestants getting tortured or burned at the stake. Also, Catholic art and publications had a similar fascination with violent imagery. And the existing stories about Vlad served as a perfect jumping-off point for German authors to create stories about him doing, well, basically any twisted thing they could imagine. The Ottomans, similarly, were happy to preserve stories about Vlad's awfulness, since it justified removing him, and made Hungary look bad for supporting him. Early biographers also played a part in this mythologizing, though sometimes to Vlad's benefit. For example, a Greek biographer who appreciated Vlad's years fighting the Ottoman Empire while acknowledging Vlad's cruelty also went out of his way to try and discredit Radu. This included claims that
His
Radu
brother
converted to Islam, which is debatable, and that he and Mehmed were actually a gay couple, a portrayal historians also find suspect since it only exists in one very anti-Ottoman source. But before you come at us, all you Mehmed Radu stans, we're not saying this wasn't a thing, just that it's not totally established fact. Ooh, but you know what is a fact? Until this very series, Rob didn't know that people actually shipped historical figures. But now he can't unknow it. Anyway, one important thing to consider is that despite all of the things said about Vlad, he was never, in any sense, accused of being a vampire.
No,
that was the work of Irish writer Bram Stoker, who ran across accounts of Vlad as he prepared to write a vampire novel that would marry Romanian folklore with 19th century technology and medical knowledge.
Now, vampirism was a thing in the 19th century that gained a lot of traction, and there were actually some significant stories of that in the United States before the story of Dracula was written. In fact, I don't know if he'll touch on this. Let me give him a minute or so to talk a little more before I show you one of those in particular.
Now, exactly how much inspiration Stoker took from Vlad has been hotly debated among historians. There are those who argue that he did extensive research on Romania, its folklore, and its history. Libraries he used have discovered margin notes in books on the subjects, and Jonathan Harker's journey into the Carpathian Mountains is broadly correct in its descriptions of routes, terrain, and even some local beliefs. Also in the novel, Stoker's Dracula even talks about raiding across the Danube and fighting the Ottomans in his life. But then the discovery of Stoker's notes in the 1970s turned a lot of these theories on their heads. Now, historians generally agree that Stoker knew little of Romania and essentially copied Harker's route and descriptions of the countryside from a 19th century travel guide.
So let's talk for a minute about some of the stories here in the United States of vampirism that I'm sure Bram Stoker probably heard about, and they were probably existing in Europe as well. I'm just not as familiar with those that inspired him to want to write a vampire story. So the most prominent one that I can think of is the New England vampire panic, which was a reaction to an outbreak of tuberculosis. If you look at the 1800s, the 19th century, tuberculosis was a very common cause of death, and a lot of times they called it consumption, and consumption is kind of a catch-all term that includes tuberculosis that could really be any number of diseases where the victim kind of is seen to be wasting away from the inside out. And there was this outbreak of tuberculosis in New England, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and other areas, and people were looking for a reason why it was happening and trying to understand, and this is before they really fully understood what was causing this. And so they started believing that there were vampires among the recently deceased who were causing this. And so they start digging up bodies, and they would ritually burn them. They would decapitate them in some cases. So here, tuberculosis was known as consumption at the time. It appeared to consume an infected person's body. It was unknown at the time it was a bacterial disease. And so in an attempt to protect the survivors and ward off the infections of the consumption, bodies of those who had died of the disease were exhumed and examined. The corpse was deemed to be feeding off the living if it was determined to be unusually fresh, especially if the heart or other organs contained liquid blood. After the culprit was identified, there were a number of proposed ways to stop the attacks. The most benign was simply to turn the body over in its grave. In other cases, families would burn the fresh organs and rebury the body. Occasionally, they would decapitate the body. Affected family members would also inhale smoke from the burned organs or consume the ashes in a further attempt to cure consumption. And then there's a list of people who we know for sure whose bodies were treated in this way. Henry David Thoreau wrote about it in 1859. It was a bit of a panic, not unlike the Salem witch trials, but I think I've read there were as many as 80 total bodies this was done to, but some historians think it's as many as 200. And there's a lot of really good videos about this where they actually go and kind of go up to New England and look at some of the graves and talk about this in detail. So just do a YouTube search for the New England vampire panic and you'll learn more about that.
His descriptions of Dracula don't match Vlad at all, and he drew upon previous English vampire novels as much as Romanian folklore. His notes, in fact, don't even contain the name Vlad III. They do, however, seem very excited about the fact that several princes were from a family line called Dracula. So excited, in fact, that in his notes he actually scrawled, "Dracula in Wallachian means devil," with Dracula and devil in all caps. In other words, he probably just liked the name, but didn't really know what it meant. Which actually was understandable, because by the 19th century, the word for devil and dragon had become interchangeable in Romanian. Plus, the local folklore of the time had forgotten the Order of the Dragon connection, claiming that Vlad was called Dracula for his cruelty. But even though his knowledge on the references he drew from, and translation of the name of its title character is flawed, Let's also try to remember that Stoker originally named his vampire Count Wampire and titled the book simply The Undead.
Now, I believe that name also comes from Vlad's line, like somewhere further down the line. Let me take a look at that real quick. Okay, I thought that I had read somewhere along the line about one of his descendants having a name similar to that, but I just couldn't find anything, so I might just be remembering that wrong.
I know, Zoe. I wouldn't watch Christopher Lee in that either. So that's how the outside world knew Vlad the Impaler. From Stoker's moderately successful novel, to blockbuster play, television and film adaptations, to Halloween costumes, games, and a whole tourism industry in Romania
Castlevania.
centered around
the game.
Dracula's castle. A castle that Vlad probably never visited, and that Bram Stoker never saw. But don't let that stop you from going, actually, because it's still a pretty freaking cool castle. But that international fame is only half the story. Because while everyone outside Romania saw Vlad as either a psychopath or blood-drinking Victorian monster, Romania itself had its own view. To speak very broadly, in the century after Vlad's death, Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman tributary states, whereas Transylvania remained independent for 2 centuries before falling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times, between 2 and 3 of the kingdoms shared the same monarch, drawing them closer together. Then by the 19th century, the 3 had enough of a shared sense of identity that they launched a series of simultaneous rebellions with the goal of independence. Finally, in 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, Wallachia and Moldavia united to form Romania and later added Transylvania after World War I. And a core component of 19th century nationalism was drawing historical heroes out from history.
Yep.
And at a time when Wallachia...
You need something that unites people, something to rally behind. And very often that's behind a person. And that's common in all nations throughout history, to rally behind an individual that they can all support. And so this becomes one of those folk heroes for people.
And Moldavia were struggling for independence from Ottoman rule. Vlad the Impaler fit the mold of a hero that spoke to the present issue. In Romania, he was seen as a brutal but fair ruler who kept Wallachia independent for a time and died defending his land from greater powers. Now, if you've watched all this series, you've probably concluded that Vlad cared more about gaining and keeping personal power than any noble cause. But as is often the case with nationalistic heroes, this was ignored in favor of a story that fit more neatly with 19th century Romanian politics. The image of Vlad as an independence fighter, doing what had to be done to keep his kingdom independent from the Ottomans, just felt true at the time.
And, it's always a really difficult thing because there can be very strong personal motives, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they don't also believe in the cause. Some of the leaders of the American Revolutionary War, for example, had very strong personal interests in the outcome, especially when it came to land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And there was a lot of money to be made in independence from Britain. That doesn't mean they didn't also believe in the cause. They just might have also had very strong selfish motives for wanting that cause to be successful.
And turned Vlad into a national symbol. Though to be fair, even though Vlad remains a celebrated figure in modern Romania, many Romanians continue to debate over whether the country should really be proud of him. Who'da thunk it? This stuff's complicated. But all of these disparate opinions of Vlad's story only serve to make it more interesting. From a life that was messy, often confusing, and of, let's just say, ambiguous loyalties, later writers have crafted Vlad into everything from a nationalist icon, to horror character, to folklore figure, to literary vampire, and to bait for tourist traps. Meaning, he's a fascinating study in how, if you're famous enough, one day you may end up rising from your grave to become something else entirely. Which makes you want to take a good look in the mirror, doesn't it?
That was pretty good. So one last thing I want to take a look at are a couple of the stories about what happened to him after he died. Where did he end up? Because obviously with all the vampire stories, the location of his body becomes a very fascinating thing to look into. So one of the most common traditional burial places for his body, with or without his head, probably without, is the Comana Monastery. And that's what they usually say is where he was buried. This monastery fortress was founded and built by Vlad in 1461. Some say 1471. 500 years later, a headless body was found during excavation work in the 1970s. It could have been the real-life Dracula. But Kamana Monastery has been rebuilt several times, and, this is it here. And a lot of people don't buy the fact that he was buried there. A lot of people say maybe Snagov Monastery, which is on a small island in the middle of Snagov Lake, which is 30 kilometers north of Bucharest. So some people suggest that is where he was buried. And there's a lot of great articles about this. I won't take the time to look at all of them. But the more modern story that broke about 7 or 8 years ago is this idea that this church in Naples, in Italy, could house his tomb. And it centers around this tomb that's got a dragon on it that seems out of place to a lot of people. And they're trying to get permission to exhume the body inside and examine it to see. Basically, it says the headless body of Vlad the Impaler, a.k.a. Dracula, may have been interred more than a half a millennium ago at the Church of Santa Maria la Nova in the center of Naples, Italy, some scholars say. His burial place is unknown. It was long thought to have been interred in a monastery near Bucharest, but excavations there in 1933 found no tomb beneath the unmarked grave thought to be his. Some hypothesize that his daughter fled to Naples with his remains and put them in a marble sarcophagus in the church. So there is just one of many of the stories that people have about what happened to him. Make your own conclusion. It's fascinating. It would be very cool if they were able to nail something down and find him, kind of like how they found Richard III a number of years ago in a parking lot in England, in Leicester. But we'll never know for sure. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again tomorrow with another reaction video.